All right, and we are live. All right, so we're going to be continuing our response to Christian idealism. We started our response yesterday in response to the stream on the problem of evil. We're going to start this stream out by actually addressing, Christian idealism actually posted a comment on the previous stream. I'm not going to read out the whole comment because that'll take too much time, but I'll just read out the parts that are like of most interest to me, the parts that sort of like address what was being said in the video, and I'll give sort of my immediate thoughts on them. I have not, unfortunately, I haven't read the papers he cited here by Nevin Kleimanhanga. I plan to do so. Maybe I'll do so before I have the discussion with him. But for now, I guess I'm just going to say like my immediate sort of thoughts. So like what he says here, for the philosophy of religion debate, there are two main points I want to make. The axiological dimension is crucial for doing any sort of Bayesian updating. This gives us the probability function. Probability of evidence given theism equals probability of evidence and probability of not evidence. Situated in a higher order explanatory framework, axiology, E being the proposition that that the observation has an identifiable positive feature. Richard Swinburne has what I think is a positive formulation of what we ought to expect from God's actions. That his actions will always be directed towards some good, and will never act towards some bad. Thus, whatever we identify as the handiwork of God, it only attains because God apprehended its goodness. That gives us the axiological relevance thesis. ART, what guides our understanding of theistic confirmation is its relevance to axiology. Naturalism is axiologically indifferent. Indifference hypothesis, as it doesn't it doesn't act towards what is axiologically relevant. All right, so the thing that immediately strikes out to me as a bit of a concern here is that it almost seems like Kyle is like wanting to treat like the axiological theory we take to be part of the hypothesis as something that's like independent, like it's not something that's like uniquely added to one of the hypotheses. And when it seems to me that that's not exactly the case, right? Because if you're endorsing a particular axiology, then that's going to like reshape the sort of predictive expectations that theism will generate and the sort of the explanatory content of theism, whereas it won't be doing that for naturalism. So it seems to me that whatever axiological theory you endorse, because like the content of the theory, the theistic hypothesis actually includes axiological predicates, right? Like God is an all good God. So like whatever axiological theory you endorse, it seems to me is going to sort of be reshaping the sort of content of the theistic hypothesis. So to treat it as like, oh, there's this independent axiological framework which we're using to evaluate both hypotheses, it just doesn't seem right to me. That seems a bit suspicious to me. I don't know. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's clear that there's going to be some immediate axiological implications of theism. You don't have to add anything on to theism to get that. It's still not clear to me how Kyle thinks those axiological assumptions built into theism get us to solve the problem of evil.
Well, I think
I
he's probably like trying to.
so
He wants to endorse some specific axiology. Maybe he wants to update the axiology based on the data so that
right.
reshape the content of the axiology to like sort of predict the data. But then it seems to me that you're just reshaping the theistic hypothesis to account the data. So then you're just telling sort of like a just so story, or at least you seem to be open to that criticism. Um,
Right.
and like axiology has no relevance to the naturalistic hypothesis. It just reshaping the axiology will just reshape the theistic hypothesis. And if you don't independently motivate the axiology, like if you want to use like a sort of generic axiology where God's goodness is just sort of constituted by what ethicists would call thick moral properties like kindness, justice, and lovingness, and you can sort of like restrict what we would expect on theism given this sort of like generic axiology, some non-controversial axiology, that's going to be fine, but then that's not going to really avoid the problem of evil at all. Like that's going to, in fact, if you use that sort of axiology, prima facie evil states of affairs, or specific facts about evolution and pain and pleasure, and the things that Draper brings up are going to be highly unexpected on theism. So it seems like he needs to be endorsing a sort of more specific axiology, but then when you start doing that, it seems to me that you're just sort of adding to the content of theism, and you're sort of lowering the prior, telling a just so story, and all these sorts of objections that I want to lay out here.
Yeah, I mean, he says that the theism is going to be situated in a higher order explanatory theory, and that higher order explanatory theory is the axiology.
Yeah.
It's still not clear to me exactly what that means, actually. I mean, I get that theism is going to have some built-in like axiological assumptions, but like you're saying, if Kyle wants to endorse a specific axiology, it seems like that's going to involve reshaping the theistic hypothesis based on the data, which is what I think Kyle wants to do. But from his explanation, it's still not obvious to me how you're meant to be able to do this without affecting the prior probability of theism,
And
or
why
without
you wouldn't
having
be able to
to
do this
address
to
these basic
naturalism as
points.
well, right?
Right, and that's a good point. I mean, Kyle says that theism is more friendly to updating in light of some axiological framework than naturalism, but I mean that's actually not necessarily true to me, right? It seems like it depends on the naturalistic hypothesis you choose or the theistic hypothesis you choose. Like there's a bunch of naturalists who would have no problem situating their theory within some higher order axiological framework. I personally wouldn't be one of them, but you could definitely do that if you wanted to.
And you don't even have to use axiology. You can just say, well, there's these built-in prior dispositions. We can situate both frameworks within, I don't know, some sort of prior disposition theory. And then when you see the data of like life obtaining, well, you can just say, oh, well, we're updating naturalism such that there's like a prior disposition to create life. I don't know. It doesn't seem that there's like a relevant asymmetry here. So
Right. And let me address what he says in the second point, because this is specifically towards me. I don't remember what I said. I mean, perhaps I misspoke in the first video, but I definitely agree that the way that I don't think the way that explanation works is that in terms of the temporal order has to be you make the theory and then you see the data after,
right. Yeah,
and that you can't have like I agree, but temporally it doesn't need to go in that direction, right? There are lots of examples in science of there being data that we already knew about that end up confirming a theory we make later on.
Relativity and the what was it? The orbit of Mars or something? I can't remember.
I think the perihelion of Mercury,
Mercury,
and
sorry,
I'm not sure it's general the perihelion of Mercury, and is it relativity that confirms? I don't remember exactly what that confirms, but
that
there's
was an old
classic.
thing. That wasn't like it didn't temporally precede, right? It was just
right.
it was predicted by old evidence.
Yeah. So we knew about the perihelion of Mercury, much before the theory that it confirmed was articulated, but obviously it still confirmed that theory. So I agree with Kyle. What I was saying is that you need to talk in terms of antecedent probabilities, which isn't about the temporal order of things. It's about abstracting out from what we know to be the case and asking what you would expect on a hypothesis, independent of the fact that you know it to be true. So if you abstract out from the data of the perihelion of Mercury and you look at, let me actually just Google it and be sure it's true, but is it general relativity? Because I don't want to be.
I think it's general relativity, yes.
Okay, well, we'll say general relativity. If that's not what it is, just imagine that what it is being put in. But you can imagine abstracting out from the fact that we know that the perihelion of Mercury works the way it does, and asking what will we expect on general relativity, and then you would expect that you would get the perihelion of Mercury, and it confirms it in that sense. So antecedent probability isn't about the temporal ordering of things; it's about like the evidential ordering of things within a more abstract framework of thinking about the data and the theory. So you need to ask, like, independently of the fact that we know this to be true, how likely is it on theory A versus theory B? And that doesn't mean that the theory and the data need to come in some sort of temporal order. It just means that when we're reasoning about it logically, we need to think about it in that sense. So I hope that's clear about why it's not a temporal ordering. It's a like logical ordering or an evidential ordering that you think about abstractly.
Right. As long as you're not constructing the hypothesis specifically to account for the data, as long as it's like sort of an independent thing that it accounts for the evidence, and yeah.
And there's a very important like logical reason why things need to be done in this manner, and that's simply that if you know that a piece of data obtains, then obviously it's going to just be trivial that like your hypothesis entails with data. Like given that theism is true and given that we see suffering, obviously. The probability of suffering on theism is 1. So that's why you need to ask what the probability of suffering is, independent of the fact that we know it to be true on theism. That isn't to say that you can, add auxiliary hypotheses to theism in light of the evidence. But when you add those auxiliary hypotheses, you can't, you need to ask how plausible they are. You need to ask how likely they are on theism. How ad hoc they are. You need to ask all those sorts of questions. And one more point I want to make is that Kyle. And to be fair, again, I also haven't read those 2 papers. I would like to. I've just been super busy lately, so I haven't had the chance to greatly look into some of the stuff that Kyle is referencing here, but he still hasn't answered the very basic question I have about, when it is appropriate to update a hypothesis in light of a data such that it doesn't affect its prior probability and when it's not. I have a extremely straightforward framework for doing that that I would just cite from Draper, which I can actually, maybe we can put the formula for it in the comments of your video. But It's essentially what's the probability of that auxiliary hypothesis on the original theory, plus what's the probability of the evidence on the original theory plus the auxiliary hypothesis. And you do what's called the weighted average principle. So you take those 2 terms and you add them to basically the probability of the data on the original or the negation of the the data on the original theory. It's a long formula. I won't go through the whole thing, but there's a very basic principle called the weighted average principle you can use to calculate the probability of evidence in light of adding an auxiliary hypothesis. I would just like to see something from Kyle that's comparable to that, or have him explain why he thinks that formula isn't the correct one to use. I'll actually pull it up right now to make sure I state it properly.
Right. Yeah, you can send it to me as well. I'll put it in the description or the comments or something.
Yeah. Yeah, but we can move on unless you want to say more about.
Well, there's another comment he posts.
Oh, okay. You can go.
I'll just read, I respond to him. This is where I sort of ask him, sort of what you asked. So this clarifies how theism is supposed to predict some state of affairs, given that the state of affairs has some value mapped onto God's reason for exercising it. What's not clear to me, and I believe this is naturalism next main hookup as well, is how you can make the move of modifying the theistic hypothesis when you discover new data, such that the data is no longer surprising in theism. When this is an appropriate move to make, and when not. Why, for instance, this wouldn't be a move equally available to the naturalist, mutatis mutandis, to the fine-tuning data, the existence of the universe and embodied moral agents, or other data taken to be evidence for theism, etc., and how this doesn't compromise the prior probability of theism and other theoretical virtues. I understand you want to say that there's an entailment relation to avoid issues of lowering the prior, but as discussed in the video, if it's an entailment from theism conjoined with the data, then we can grant that, but it's fully consistent with the data of evil being antecedently very improbable on theism relative to naturalism, which is indeed what we want to argue with the evidential problem of evil. If it's an entailment from the bare content of theism without considering the data, then you aren't learning and updating based on the data, and it's eminently unclear how such an entailment is derived. This, I think, is our main issue. And he responded, and I'm still very unclear. Maybe you can help me out, understand this, but I'm very unclear on how this actually sort of answers my concern. I'm happy to admit that, based on these comments, that Kyle seems to know more about probability theory than I do. I'm not that educated on the subject. I'm going to be the first to admit that. But I'm pretty decent at sort of tracking dialectical contexts. But I just don't understand how this really addresses our concern here. So. He talks about why him taking Bayesian confirmation theory to be holistic. This means that one set of outcomes occupies the probability space of another set, and creating mutual entailments. This is a well-known phenomenon among philosophically sophisticated probabilists. Consider this theorem: P biconditionally entails Q if probability of P is equal to the probability of Q. Epistemologically, confirmation is transferred across entailment without loss. Now, this is where it starts to get really weird to me. He says the resurrection obviously kind of entails theism. I already just don't know what that means. What is kind of entailment? Entailment isn't the kind of relation that comes in degrees, right? Something either entails something or it doesn't. So, he's obviously using some gerrymandered sense of entailment, and I'm not entirely sure, what that even is.
It's also definitely not true that the resurrection entails theism, as far as I'm concerned. But
yeah,
that's maybe another discussion.
Yeah, and it's just altogether not clear what he's saying here. And theism entails resurrection of the dead, given the defeat condition, and that the dead would be defeated. But this goes back to our point earlier. Is he using the data to make this entailment, right? Is he saying that theism, given that there are dead people, entails a resurrection? Or is he saying that theism, the bare content of theism, entails that there will be dead people and a resurrection, right? And that's sort of our thing, right? Maybe theism plus the data of evil and suffering we see jointly entails that it'll be defeated, given the defeat condition. But the bare content of theism doesn't seem to entail, that there will be evil and that it will be defeated in the afterlife, unless you have a reason for thinking that. And I don't think Kyle has offered one. And if you're just using the data, if you're just taking the data and you're using that to construct the hypothesis and derive the entailment, then just seems to me that you haven't actually you just sort of already lost the game here. You already changed the subject. That has nothing to do with the problem of evil. We're talking about antecedent probabilities here. We're talking about whether the data would be antecedently probable on the theistic hypothesis. Is that right?
Yeah.
Right. So, and then he goes on to talk about a bunch of other stuff about how confirmation relations are symmetric. He talks about how atheism would entail evolution. It's a bunch of stuff that I don't understand how it really addresses our concern here. Maybe I'm not tracking. It would be probably better if we had a discussion on this so we can sort of hash this out. There's a good chance that there's something I'm missing here, but I just don't understand how it addresses our concern.
Yeah, I mean, he never actually answers the question of when can you do this and when can't you do this.
And
I mean, I definitely. I mean, let me state something that I think is definitely true. If you can show that bare theism entails things that themselves entail that evil exists, then I agree that that would be an answer to the problem of evil. But Kyle hasn't really attempted to show that. So, you know what I mean? Like, if you can show that your hypothesis entails auxiliary hypotheses that entail evil, then sure, that's going to answer the question. But I'm not sure that Kyle's really attempted to do that. He seems to want to say he's doing something like that, but in light of the data, updating it in light of that in a way that isn't going to affect the prior probability. But it's just not clear to me either. But again, like, I think it'd be better to just talk about this over within an actual discussion because it's just too much back and forth without understanding to keep going this way.
Based on what he's saying here, he just seems to be sort of talking about, talking broadly about his confirmation theory, but that's not really our concern here. We're asking how you can do this with theism and why this move wouldn't be available to the naturalists, and it's not clear what his answer to that is. It's just not clear to me. I don't understand it. But yeah.
And quickly before we go to the video, I'll state the weighted average principle because I think I forgot like the exact wording of a second term, just so in case people are interested. So this is how I would suggest you evaluate an auxiliary hypothesis on theism. You take the probability of the auxiliary hypothesis on theism and you multiply it by the probability of the evidence given theism and that auxiliary hypothesis, and you add that to the probability of the negation of the auxiliary hypothesis on theism multiplied by the probability of the evidence on theism and the negation of the auxiliary hypothesis. So you take a weighted average basically of the auxiliary hypothesis and how likely that is on theism and how well it explains the data, and the theism without that auxiliary hypothesis. You put those two terms together and that gives you the probability of the evidence on theism. It's a pretty straightforward, clear way to do things. I don't know why we shouldn't just do that when evaluating the probability of auxiliary hypotheses on theism. I mean, that's what Draper suggests, and that's what many theists seem to basically attempt to do.
Right. You have a fan in here in the chat, by the way. Love naturalism next. Great to see new content from him as well. Thought we went dormant. Lol.
No, I do have a lot of more content planned. I've just been very busy with.
Post planned, right?
Yeah, I have two very long blog posts planned. One is going to be like a whole comprehensive why I'm an atheist post where I go through all of those sort of data for theism and naturalism and explain why I favor naturalism. And that's going to have a video accompanying it. And then I also have a big blog post and video coming out on limited materialism too as well, where I explain that position, since that's been something I've been spending a lot of time thinking about lately, but haven't had the chance to like make any content about. It's just been so busy in my personal life that I haven't had time to do it. But those are both in the works. So
yeah, well, I look forward to reading that. So yeah, let's just get started because we already spent like 17 minutes, over 17 minutes responding to Kyle's comment here. So let's
go.
That's not what we're doing. Again, there's this process called theory.
And the volume's good for you, just to be clear, right?
What'd you say? Sorry.
The volume's good for you. You can hear it.
Yep.
Loud and clear,
Yep.
right?
Yep. We're good.
Right. Learning. Okay. And what you do is, with that theoretical learning, you can actually rule out certain theistic hypotheses from that, right? And what you're going to be left with is basically, so once you contextualize the evidence and once you've updated your priors, then you can make that sort of argument that, hey, theism entails this story or that story, right? And I would argue, of course, that theism entails the Christian story of the world. But yeah, no, this whole idea like, oh, we're just inventing stories or blah, blah, blah. No, that's not how it works. What it is you're learning from experience, or it's, again, the formal term is theoretical learning. But yeah, that involves like changing sort of the theoretical content of your hypothesis to sort of, I mean, scientists do this all the time. So unless you want to argue that like science is ad hoc because it's always changing itself, it just doesn't really make any sort of sense. But anyways, I'm gonna continue on now.
Right, so we already sort of addressed this yesterday with regards to theoretical learning, and I went through the SCP page. I sort of I didn't like go in depth with it, but the basic idea is that if you want to apply this idea of theoretical learning to sort of update and partition the outcome space of a hypothesis, it seems to me that either the hypothesis is going to have to be refutable or verifiable, so as a disjunction, either refutable or verifiable. That is and what this means is that some finite set of observations entails that the hypothesis is false, like it actually entails that the hypothesis is false, or some finite set of observations entails that the hypothesis is true. And if Kyle wants to use a defeat condition, like it seems to me that if there's any finite set of observations that's going to entail the falsity of the theistic hypothesis, it's going to be something related to the evil we see in the world. That's plausibly going to be what entails the falsity of the theistic hypothesis. But on Kyle's sort of picture, any finite set of evils is going to be consistent with the evil being defeated on the afterlife, such that on the infinite on the grand scheme of things, the evil is all things considered good. It's part of a greater compossible whole, as Kyle wants to say. So the theistic hypothesis isn't refutable, and it's not verifiable either because, well, I mean, any finite set of observations is going to be consistent with the being in question being very powerful rather than infinitely powerful, right? In order to verify that a being is infinitely powerful or infinitely knowledgeable, you in principle need an infinite set of observations. So it's not. So it seems to me the theistic hypothesis is not verifiable or refutable. The bare theistic hypothesis, at least. Now, what Kyle could be saying is that there's this disjunction of specific theistic hypotheses that posit more specific desires of God that are, verifiable or refutable. So say there's a specific theistic hypothesis where God wants to create a world with just ice cream. Well, since we don't see a world with just ice cream, that refutes that, specific theistic hypothesis. But then when we're refuting, specific theistic hypothesis, that doesn't tell us, that's not updating the outcome space for the bare theistic hypothesis. That seems to just be doing something else. Like that you refuted some specific theistic hypothesis that you just sort of invented as a part of this disjunction. That doesn't tell us anything about what the entailments are from the bare content of the theistic hypothesis. So it seems to me that using theoretical learning, it's not clear at all how he updates from the theistic hypothesis. It's not clear to me at all. Like, for example, you might have like a disjunction such as, all but finitely many swans are white, and that's going to be a disjunction. There's one swan that's white and the rest are black. There's two swans that are white, the rest are black. But that's going to be a disjunctive hypothesis, whereas the bare theism isn't really a disjunctive hypothesis. You can have a disjunction of specific theisms, but that's not bare theism. So that's my point on that. Do you have anything further to add there?
The only thing I'll say is even if Kyle was correct about this theoretical learning thing, Kyle says, well, I think he said something like, I want to argue that through theoretical learning, we learned that theism entails like the Christian story. Well, it's one thing to say that and another thing to show that. I mean, that seems, even granting like the things Kyle wants to assume, an extremely tall order to show, but that's the case. That like the specific Christian story is something you can just learn that theism entails through like observing the data. That seems like it's going to draw on all sorts of other controversial arguments. And like you're gonna have to appeal to historical data. I mean, and I just don't see how you're possibly going to get out from that we learn that the Christian story is like the specific story entailed by theism. I just don't know how you could possibly show that, even granting many like problematic and controversial assumptions Kyle wants to make.
Right.
And he hasn't attempted to show it, as far as I can tell, in this video, but maybe he gets to it.
Well, certainly he hasn't shown an entailment, right? But yeah, let's get to right. Like you can still incur significant theoretical disadvantages. It can still be shown that theism is just going to be straightforward, just a worse explanation. It's just a bad explanation. So I think that when he said there, it is just incorrect. When it's not clear to me that's the case at all, it seems to me that Sorry, I disagree with what he's saying. He's saying basically that the atheist has to invent their own value theory in order to detect the problem of evil. It has to work with the assumption of some sort of axiological theory. When it's not clear to me that's the case at all, it seems to me that even if you want to frame the problem of evil with axiology in the first place, again, it's controversial. Like, again, as I pointed out, Michael Tooley wants to frame the problem of evil.
Yeah, and I've already addressed the fact that deontology is a subset of axiology. So even Michael Tooley's argument also makes
You've already addressed this part.
axiological assumptions, even if it doesn't explicitly say that, right? So I've already addressed this before, so I'm not going to say much on it here.
The ontological terminology or the axiological terminology. In fact, I'm actually kind of partial to their approach as well because I think that framing the problem of evil with the axiological terminology often leads to sort of consequentialist reasoning that I'm not a huge fan of as a deontologist. So basically, it's funny how I kind of like called that in my original video, how I said that like using like axiology alone leads to consequentialism, and it seems to be exactly what Kyle's doing in this video too. But yeah. Like, first of all, like, it's not clear that you would use the frame as axiological terms at all, and second of all, like, it seems to me that you could run the problem was an internal critique. It seems to me that the atheist needs to
Okay, so this is a fair criticism, but I will say, but I never said that the atheists themselves has to hold to the axiology. That's not what I said. What I said is that if they want to use a problem of evil, they have to start off with an axiology in order to generate the problem of evil. I didn't say that they themselves had to hold to that axiology. What I said, or what I mean by that is, like, I didn't say that like they themselves have to like actually propositionally hold to the axiology. What I'm saying is that in order for them to generate this problem of evil, they have to start off with axiology because that's how it gets off the ground, right? In order for a problem of evil to get off the ground, you have to assume an axiology, which means, again, you don't have, the atheist does not themselves have to believe in axiology, but if they want to present an argument, right, an actual argument from evil, they have to use an axiology. Like they have to, because any premise in an argument from evil is going to include axiological assumptions, right? And those include Michael Tooley's argument from deontology, those include any consequentialist argument, those any argument where there's goodness or badness involved, right, regardless of which theory of normative ethics you hold to, is going to include axiological assumptions. That's what axiology is, right? So this whole idea that, oh, well, I don't need axiology. Well, if you throw out the axiology, you can't use an argument from evil, right? So it's not going to work, right? And so I think he's making, again, he's making, it seems like he's misunderstanding what I'm saying here. I'm not saying that the atheist themselves has to hold to the axiology, right? What I'm saying is that in order for them to generate a problem, in order for them to present an argument to the theist, they have to assume an axiology. Not, again, they don't have to themselves believe in it, but the argument that they use depends on that axiology, right? That's all I'm saying. Okay, so
Do you have any thoughts on what he says here? I know I've been talking a lot, so I'll just let you address this part.
I don't think that's really true. It seems like you could run let's say, even if you let's say you had some version of theism where, and some theists think this, where, moral realism isn't true, and it's just about like what God desires, and God desires that there isn't suffering, and then you observe suffering. It seems like you could run the problem of evil just based on that. Like say, hey, we observe like a lot of pain and suffering, and that's something that God doesn't like. That doesn't seem to necessarily include like any broad axiological theory in order to run that kind of problem of evil. I think it depends on what he is meaning by axiology, which is something we got into last time. But I think in general, like, yes, you're going to need to generate some sort of expectation based on theism, and that's going to require knowing something about God, what God would desire or want, or like how God would build the world. And whether or not that is going to require referencing axiology depends like how broadly you're using that term. In the way that Kyle wants to use it, I'm not sure.
Right. Yeah. I guess it does depend on how broadly you're using the term. I would say that there's going to be certain things that follow from just the concept of the good that we're using, and presumably, like, if we're using a concept of the good, like a standard understanding of what goodness is going to, as I said earlier, be constituted by some set of what ethicists call thick moral properties. So God, all things considered, since he's good, he's going to be expected to be kind, just, all these sort of, more specific thick moral properties. And you could sort of like restrict or sort of like understand what would be expected from the theistic hypothesis sort of based on this. But I don't think you need to have like a more specific axiological theory other than understanding that goodness, you have a concept of the good as constituted by thick moral properties.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think more fundamentally in axiology, what you really need is an expectation of what God would want and desire. Like that seems like the really fundamental thing over any sort of like axiological framework, is an understanding of what to expect on theism, in the sense of like God's going to have certain desires, or if you don't want to say God has desires, God's going to have some sort of set of rules or assumptions that God uses to build the world, and you need to understand those. That seems like the fundamental thing you need to run the problem of evil.
Right. Yeah. And that's,
I guess I'll leave it at that.
That's going to be downstream of kindness and justice or whatever.
Anyways, let's continue on.
Let's get to this one.
Right. I mean, there's now. We're going to have to assume that you have to assume that there are bad things there in the first place. So we're going to be around. You're going to have to assume that there's a set of values that
Well, you can say that a set of values that, in accordance with the Christian worldview, or accordance with God's standards or what have you, are bad. And basically, according to God's own objective standards, God is according to violating his own objective standards. So basically, that's one way to frame the problem. So I just don't accept that.
I mean, I agree with that. It's internal critique, but that was not. Anyways.
If he needs to assume their own axiology, it needs to be internal critique. And I also don't accept that we shouldn't be framing this in terms of values or axiology. I think we should be framing this in terms of what actions or principle and inferences.
That's all. God's good. Therefore, give us a value theory. God only do what he's right? The problem here is there are quality value. There's trying to see if he. Here we go.
It's not clear to me that those are going to be theories of value. I guess virtue ethics kind of is a theory of value, but like, it seems to me that most utilitarian theories are theories of moral reasons and the properties of actions, right?
Yeah, and moral reasons are part of axiology. See, this is the reason why I don't get too much into moral philosophy, because I think it's just a subset of shared morality. Like, I could just present the same exact scenario to them, right? And I can still run this objection that I have here in be a moral value theory.
Ahead because we've already addressed this point. Fictional works, right? So imagine like reading a story and kind of fictional instances of suffering. Suffering doesn't actually exemplify the world, rather instantiated in this world of fiction, right, created by some author. You can imagine a world where people were part of that and have sympathy for the characters in the story, whereas no actual suffering is exemplified in the world. So it seems to me that's what it was.
That might work for that example, at least for sympathy, but I don't think it works when we're talking like self-sacrificial love, or we're talking about courage, or when we're talking about there's a lot of examples I can bring up, but when we're talking about feeling like actually getting to know somebody, like, and understand their struggles and their pains and like going through them, what I would term defeating them, right? You're not gonna be able to get that on a view where everything's just sort of learned, or all the virtues are just sort of acquired through like this fictional narrative, because there are many virtues that I would say that you cannot have without actual like objective suffering going on, right? So that's really all I have to say on that. I mean, it is a fair criticism, I think. Like, yeah, maybe in some circumstances you could have certain like moral virtues without suffering, right? But that's definitely not the case. Like, there's a large number of virtues that you cannot have that with, and especially you definitely cannot have defeat with that, right? Which I would say is probably one of the biggest best virtues, which is basically the idea that we talk about self-sacrificial love when we're talking about those sort of higher level virtues that a lot of the saints had. You're not going to really have that on a sort of non-suffering world, right? And again, if you go back, and I'll mention this later in the video, but like all that God needs to do in order to work, the only sort of like condition that God needs to follow when it comes to allowing suffering is the defeat condition, right? So that's all. Like that's all that God needs to follow in terms of like what are the.
Okay, we'll get into the defeat condition later, but my basic point here was that it seems like often when theists appeal to, like in the original video, my point was that it seems that when theists appeal to things like the soul building theodicy, I often think a problem is that there seems to be like a lack of imagination here. Like, it doesn't seem to me that in order to have like these soul building virtues, there needs to be like suffering, or even at least not like an immense amount of suffering. And he brings up like courage here, like maybe courage requires some amount of suffering, but that's also not obvious to me because it seems to me that you can have courage built from athleticism rather than built from soldiers fighting in war, and athleticism, engaging in the sports and being brave, charging towards victory doesn't seem to entail like a substantive amount of suffering. And as well with sympathy, the example I used in the video is that it seems like sympathy can be built through reading fictional novels and like developing sympathy for the characters in the book, and moral learning can be developed through like understanding that you shouldn't act like the villain in a story. So it seems to me like this is just a sort of like broad point that I think soul building theodicies often stem from sort of like a lack of imagination as to the possibilities that God could actualize. Do you have anything to add there?
Nothing to add. I have some thoughts on defeat, but I think I'll save them to hear more what he says about it.
Okay.
The evils that God is allowed to permit, right? And I think that alone sort of accounts for the evil that we see in the world. So, anyways, there's more I can say on this, but that's all I have to say on that critique.
I don't even think like virtue ethics would say that. It doesn't seem like basically the virtue ethics would say that that maybe like a big part of virtue ethics they say that there's like intentionality about like what's right to do, right? And it's not clear like whereas it might be like all things considered good for there to be virtues in the world, the virtue ethics not theory, virtue ethics theory. It doesn't seem to me that means that God would be like permitted to allow that, right? Because it's not exactly sympathetic of God to.
Why would it not be allowed for God to permit that? Again, if we're using the defeat condition as a condition that God has to follow, where's the defeat condition being violated here? Like, I mean, unless he's going by the necessity condition, which I'm assuming is, that's what most people do. But yeah. Anyways, I'm not going to say much on this part because there's more that could be said later.
Okay, I'll let you say a few things in the defeat condition here, but there's going to be more that's going to be said on it later. So I'll just let you say a couple things on it.
Maybe I'll just wait for later then, because I like my thoughts on the defeat condition are pretty broad, and I'm not sure what Kyle thinks about it.
Okay.
I mean,
yeah, in that case, maybe I'll skip a little bit ahead then.
Yeah, let's skip to
later. But I think we can already tell here that he's not actually addressing what I said thus far in terms of this, because if he actually understood what I was saying, he would realize like, hey, maybe this is a pretty good argument. But anyways, people have their own opinions on that. But whatever.
It'd be surprising if didn't make the research.
All right, so he's bringing up the pain and pleasure argument
Okay,
here.
now this is I think this is where we get into a little bit more meat, because this is where he actually directly addresses Draper's pain and pleasure argument.
Okay, cool.
Now there's a lot I can say on this. But the thing with the pain and pleasure argument is that it has to sort of assume, like, it has to have like what's called this evolutionary background, so to speak, right? And one of the things about that, let me see if I can find my notes on this, because there's a lot I could say on the pain and pleasure argument. Let's see here. So the problem is, first of all, psychophysical suffering, right? So when we're talking about pain and pleasure, which is psychophysical suffering, logically entails the existence of embodied consciousness, okay? Which means that you're going to have to assume the evidence for theism in the background already from the start, right? And the issue, again, comes down to this idea of Bayesian learning theory, where you have to go back and you have to think, like, okay, you know what, I'm just going to, Trent's going to hate me for this, but I'm going to play this and see what people...
All right, he's about to play a clip from Trent Horn.
Trent Doherty, you mean?
Trent Doherty, not Trent Horn. I get those guys mixed up all the time.
Yeah.
Look, he's got this situation where he talks about learning over time, where the theist makes a prediction and the atheist makes a prediction, and it has to do with priors about the distribution of pleasure and pain and their correlation with moral properties. And this is probably the best thing he has to say on this is the recognition that really it's, I forget what he calls it, like moral theism or something like that, moral supernaturalism. That's really what distinguishes theism from naturalism. That naturalism is morally indifferent. And so the whole program is that you expect these correlations between pleasure and pain with virtue and vice and so forth at these various levels. And he talks about first at the cosmic level, I think, and then at the plant level and the animal level, et cetera, et cetera. What he completely neglects is the whole idea of sort of version of what's called logical learning or revision of priors, which is whole literature on this. Basically, Paul is committed to an axiom that Richard Jeffrey, I think, calls regularity, that your priors are set and can never change, and basically no real Bayesian thinks this. So what he ignores is that the theist can say, on that first, bless you, I don't know if you're my wife, sneeze in the background. What he ignores is the fact that even if on the first round of predictions, the theist is like, well, that's surprising. What the theist can then do is go, now why might, given that that's not what I would have predicted, how might I have had incorrect expectations here? What would lead a God, were there a God, to do such a thing? And that might give you the insight that leads to soul-making theodicies, or ultimately what I call the saint-making theodicy, where God has higher values that are instrumental than just a world of perfect paradise, for especially the virtuous. The virtuous are not meant to just have virtue bestowed upon them. It has to be earned. It has to be hard-won. And so you can come to realize those things through watching what God actually does allow in the world. That is a type of learning from experience that Paul just seems to utterly, completely ignore, and yet it's part and parcel of the human experience.
All right, so I don't know if Trent's going to hate me for that, but...
Okay, so I'm just going to let you tell me your thoughts on that one.
I mean, I have zero problem with theists proposing, even based on the data that we observing or like creating theodicies and conjoining them with theism to try and predict the data. I just don't think their theodicies work. Like in general, I think the soul-making theodicy, for instance, has lots and lots of problems. I haven't read Trent's book, maybe I'll get around to it someday. I'm sort of burnt out on problem of evil stuff because I've read so much of it. But I've never read a theodicy that I think adequately accounts for the data that we have when you can join it with theism. So, I mean, we already sort of talked about like the specific learning theory like stuff and his version of his like interpretation of how Bayesian reasoning ought to work and our issues with it. But in terms of more broadly, the idea that you might conjoin soul making to theism and predictive data, I mean, yes, this is something that like Draper addressed in his original article and had zero problem with. So in that sense, like Kyle isn't really, I mean, if Kyle actually wants to make an argument against what Draper's saying, then he ought to explain what the specific hypothesis is that he's generating, but he thinks when conjoined with theism explains the data. I agree with Kyle that you're going to have the facts that about consciousness and evolution in the background when you do this probability judgment. That's also compatible with the conclusion of Draper's argument. It can be the case that consciousness is evidence for theism, but then when I'm not granting that, by the way. I'm just saying, for the sake of argument, let's say consciousness is evidence for theism, and then we update our priors based on that. So now, now theism has a higher probability relative to naturalism than it did before you consider consciousness. And then let's say we consider evolution, and that's evidence for either theism or naturalism. And then we update our priors based on that. Okay, so now we have evolution and consciousness in the background, and now we're going to consider next the data of pain and pleasure and the data of suffering, and we'll ask, how does that affect the hypothesis of theism? And it's compatible with consciousness entailing theism, that once we learn about the data of pain and pleasure, but that reduces the probability of theism relative to naturalism, and then we update our priors in light of that. So, I don't know why theists continuously, and I don't think Kyle's necessarily doing this, but theists will always make this point about, well, what about all this other data? Well, Draper's argument was never intended to be sort of a knockdown argument against theism. It was just meant to say, hey, look, suffering is evidence against theism. Not suffering evidentially confirms naturalism relative to theism. Obviously, you have to consider the background data to consider that. But I think Kyle knows most of this, so I think he's trying to make like a more specific point about Bayesian learning theory, but I just need to hear more of the details of it to really evaluate it. And I would need to hear more about like the soul-making theodicy he wants to use and why he thinks that it predicts the specific, distribution of pain and pleasure that we see. I mean, importantly, we should emphasize that in Draper's argument, his whole point is that it seems like, pain is specifically tied to biology, such that pain really serves a primarily biological role rather than a moral role, right? It seems like basically we feel pain when it's evolutionarily useful for us to feel pain, and we feel pleasure when it's evolutionarily useful for us to feel pleasure. And when we feel pain and pleasure beyond that, it's really just sort of the result of our biological system going wacky. Like someone getting set on fire. Obviously, you don't need to feel as much pain as you do when you're set on fire to avoid fire, but that's just our sort of the non-perfect tuning of our biological mechanisms. And Draper's point is that this intrinsic link between pain and pleasure and our biological functioning rather than our moral functioning is more likely on naturalism than theism. Now, it's not clear to me what a soul-making theodicy would do to resolve that data at all yet. So I'd have to just hear more about it. Like prima facie, soul-making theodicies would lead us to expect even more that pain and pleasure would serve specifically a moral role rather than a biological role, and so would make the problem even worse, at least when it comes to that first stage of Draper's argument. So that's my initial thoughts on that.
But I agree with everything you said there. Also, is my volume, is it good?
Yeah, it's fine for me.
Okay. So, yeah, I agree with everything you said there, and also I also don't understand what Trent was getting at there with Draper assuming a specific axiom in probability theory. I've read a bunch of papers by Draper. I've read like several papers by Draper. I don't think I've read all of them, but I've never heard of this thing of him assuming some Richard Jeffrey axiom of probability that no other Bayesian accepts. I don't know where that's. I don't know. Maybe I'm missing something here. Like, have you ever heard of that?
No, I've never heard of that. Isn't Kyle a fan of like Richard Swinburne?
Yes.
Because Richard Swinburne and Draper take like exactly the same approach, as far as I can tell, in terms of the way they approach like Bayesian reasoning. I mean, if you read Swinburne's book, The Existence of God, he basically takes exactly the approach Draper does with some minor alterations. So, if you're going to reject the way that Draper does his Bayesian approach, that's going to be a problem if you want to promote Swinburne's arguments as an example. I mean, Swinburne basically like agrees. Well, I think he's changed his mind. Maybe, I don't know, Swinburne like changes his mind all the time. But in The Existence of God, the latest edition, Swinburne agrees that the problem of evil is some evidence for naturalism for pretty much the reasons that Draper gives to some degree. So, I mean, I think if you're going to reject Draper's approach, you should thereby reject Swinburne's approach too.
Okay, Jake said, actually, your volume sounds a tad bit muted and low to me, Truth Teller. All right, how is this? Is this better? Because I'm bringing. Okay, I noticed it's going a little bit higher now that I have it closer to my my mouth. And also, yeah, with regard to your point there, you're actually preempting one of my points that I'm gonna bring up actually in my slides later. When he starts accusing Draper of Bayesian malpractice, I actually make the exact same point where I say, well, if Draper's committing Bayesian malpractice, then so is Swinburne. Uh, um, but I'll get to that when I get to that. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, let's keep going. And yeah, you do sound louder now.
Okay. Good. Good.
By the way, is my audio okay? Whoever's in the chat, I'm not looking at the chat, but if someone could confirm it and you could tell me if it's okay.
Someone said earlier, some guy named Shusha said NN's volume is really low, so I don't know. Like, you're fine for
Okay.
me.
All right. Well, if my volume continues to be low, someone in the chat let me know.
Okay, no problem.
So the point here is that it's this idea of theoretical learning, and this idea that why is it that as a theist, why did my theory make these false predictions or something like that? Well, what we can do is we can update our priors and we can understand, like, hey, maybe here's the reason why God would allow it, right? And then we can update that in the priors, right? And it's not ad hoc because we're not changing. Again, we're not changing the content of theism, or at least we're not adding in the story into the priors, right? What we're doing is we're learning from experience. We're updating our priors based on new information. That's all that it is, right? And the problem is, at least the pain and pleasure argument that Draper brings up there, or that he references, right? Because it is from Paul Draper ultimately at the end of the day. The problem with that sort of argument is that it sort of assumes that God would create a world in which every single time that someone goes through pain and pleasure, that you would have sort of these moral virtues or these moral values like just inserted into them, right? Without any sort of hard work involved. And that's just completely wrong. Like, there's no reason to assume that God would create that sort of world. So even taking the best argument in regards to the argument for me, which is I would say the pain and pleasure argument, I don't think it works at all, given that sort of reason that I just mentioned. I know I spent a lot of time with this, but anyways, let's continue.
Yeah, so this sort of goes back to like what we were already saying, and I don't understand. Like he claims that he's not changing the content or he's not messing with the content of the theistic hypothesis, but I don't understand how he's able to generate these, like, do a new round of predictions or whatever he wants to do, or like, generate or change the predictive content of the hypothesis if he's not sort of like adding stuff in, right? Because it seems to me if you're just using the bare theistic hypothesis, it's uninformative. It doesn't tell you what specific states of affairs of evil we would expect. It doesn't really like tell you that. So I don't understand how, like, if you're just stipulating God and he as this being who is all good, and goodness is again constituted by these thick moral properties. All the things considered, expect God to be compassionate to his creatures, kind to his creatures, just to his creatures. Then it seems to me like instances of prima facie evil are going to be, all things considered, just based on the observation alone, without like sort of adding any background assumptions, is going to be, all things considered, unexpected on the hypothesis. I mean, yeah, sure, you can sort of say, oh well, it's possible that the evil is going to be defeated in the afterlife, but is that story antecedently more likely than the story that it's not going to be defeated in the afterlife, right? Sort of goes back to Tooley's point as well. Like, sure, it's possible that there's some unknown right-making property or some unknown right-making factor which outweighs all the known and unknown wrong-making factors, but it's also seems to me equally equiprobable that there's an unknown wrong-making factor that outweighs them, or there's no unknown wrong-making or right-making factors, or they cancel each other out. Any number of sort of auxiliary assumptions we add. It doesn't seem to me that there's any reason given to think that any of these assumptions are more antecedently probable, and unless he does give such a reason, I don't understand how this really addresses the argument. It seems to me that we just take what the evil states of affairs, like, we just take it as it is, like what it seems to be as a whole, is just a prima facie evil states of affairs that we wouldn't expect a being that's all powerful and has these thick moral attributes to permit. So I don't understand. Maybe you have more to add there.
Nothing to add. The one thing I wanted to say is that if Shusha's in the chat, I know they're really familiar with the specifics of everything to do with Bayes. So maybe if they have anything they know about Bayes theory and what Kyle's referencing in some of these comments, that might be the person to ask if they're still around.
All right.
Anyways, we can continue the video.
Okay. All right. Be like the best means God has to achieve most amount of pleasure in the world. That would be, I mean, it's not surprising on naturalism that we have this. But it'd be surprising on utilitarianism plus theism plus the background information that God would allow pain and pleasure to basically function as roles of utilitarianism. So there's even utilitarianism and utilitarianism. So actually, on all three value theories, there's an approach we can take here. Right? So it's not clear to me that there is an out for the theist in this regard. Even if we assume that we have to assume our own value theory and we have to do an eternity, or even if we assume, because I'd say that we should bring it in terms of theology, right?
And I get to the next point, which is the definition of well, theism, it's totally like, well, if you're not going to argue where you say God would create the world as perfect, right? And basically the idea is that you don't have to make lots of developments for it, right? And the idea there is that you don't have to make lots of developments for it, right? You don't have to make lots of world, or you have to make it world, right?
Okay, I'll let him continue, but like, let's see.
And this is the problem called incrementalism, right? And this idea that there's a value in our world that's technically like an world, right? So
And also, I just thought like this also relates to my point about like formal learning theory and how we are even updating the theistic hypothesis based on formal learning theory. Like I said, like it seems to me that there would actually have to be some finite set of observations which entail either the negation of the theistic hypothesis or the theistic hypothesis itself. And for the reasons I stated earlier, it seems any finite set of observations is not going to entail the theistic hypothesis because any finite set of observations you have is consistent with sort of limited being, a being who's very powerful but not all powerful. Or any finite set of observations that can entail the negation of the theistic hypothesis is going to be some set of evil that would be unexpected on the theistic hypothesis, or entail the falsity of the theistic hypothesis. But given the defeat condition, since Kyle is always going to say, well, if the process plays out long enough, given that the agent has a permanent lifespan, who's to say that their evil can't be defeated in the ultimate grand scheme of things? So it just seems to me that given Kyle's own view, it's not refutable or verifiable. So it's not clear to me how theoretical learning applies to how he can learn from the theistic hypothesis at all. So I just wanted to add that as well.
It's not universal set, like, these are the best values that are any possible if there's any kind of world. Like, are very much, like, can't really measure them, so to speak. Yeah. And I think so, that's the problem. This thing's about the actuality also sort of have this incredible issue, right? There's anybody on academics really like talk about how any world that creates all the other world, right? Any other world, it's like, okay, well, here's what's right? So in that case,
Okay, so yeah, I'm not convinced by this response, this best of all possible worlds response. There's a bunch of reasons why. For one, if God would create the best possible world, and if you assume that there's this infinite hierarchy of best possible worlds, there isn't any best possible world, then and the theists want to use this for advantage. They want to say, well, I mean, that assumes that God would create the best possible world, so God can't be judged for creating less than the best possible world. Well, we view it too fast here because, like, even though God didn't create the best possible world, there's a world better than this world that God could create, the next better world, and there's a question of why he did not create that world. We're not saying that God didn't create the best possible world. We're grant it's possible. It's possible that God could create that.
okay, so he's misunderstanding, at least he's misunderstanding what I was really saying there. So what I said was, again, that any world that God creates, there can always be a better one, but that's only if we assume what's called a value. Well, maybe I should have mentioned this originally, but basically, that assumes that God sort of is constrained by these value parts, right? As we just add value to the world and that makes it automatically better or whatever. Like there's one less hurricane, or there's one less person that dies, or like there's definitely value parts. So basically, the idea is like for any world God creates, there can always be a better one, and what that means is like, well, I can just take away if we just subtract, like, oh well, we subtract this evil over here, therefore that world over there, this world is better than that world because this world has one less like bug that died or something. That's what I mean when I talk about God cannot create the best possible world, right? But when I say that God did create the best possible world, I'm talking about it as a kind of world, not one specific world, right? I'm not talking about like our specific world, but rather I'm talking about as a type of world, right? And once we understand a type of world, then I don't think it's going to really be a problem. And in that case, then the atheist is going to have to argue like, oh, we don't live in the best type of world or the best kind of world. And I just really don't see where exactly that sort of inference can be drawn, right? Because any sort of argument you use to make that sort of argument is going to have to go through a lot of logical, axiological steps, right? That I don't think the theist is. I think there's going to be some point in which the theist just disagrees with them on that. So, anyways, I'm going to continue on because I still got an hour left, and I am at the 47-minute mark, which is interesting. Anyways, I'm going to continue on with the video because I don't want to go. I'm going to try not to go 3 hours, but we'll see how that goes.
Right. So, this is where like I'll admit that in my original video I wasn't exactly tracking the point. I thought that he was just running a sort of best possible worlds response to the problem of evil, where the evil we see is not unexpected because any world that God could create, like he could create a better world. So this is as good of a world you can get. I don't know, like something like that. I thought he was just running like a best of all just a sort of generic best of all possible worlds response. But in actuality, he's running something more specific, which relates to there being a best possible type of world. So basically what he'd say is that like a best possible type of world would be one that includes embodied moral agents, and since we're living in the kind of world that has embodied moral agents, it's a best possible type of world. And sure, there's going to be worlds with less suffering, but since it's the best possible type of world, like these worlds are incommensurable with each other in terms of value. There's no the best possible world, but there's a best possible type. It's a token of the type we're living in, best possible kind of world. And just because it has evil in it, that doesn't show anything because it's still the best possible type of world. So I'll let you tell me your thoughts on that. That's sort of like one of the theodicies he's running.
That we live in the best possible type of world, and is the idea that the demand for the actual best possible world isn't fair because like it's arbitrary, it's vague. So really, all you can demand is the best possible type of world. Is that basically what he thinks?
He's saying that there's a problem of incommensurability in terms of values, right? If you say, oh, why didn't God prevent slightly more evil? Well, we're already in a best possible type of world, and each world is incommensurable with each other. So there's incommensurable values here. I think that's
right.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean that's there's some complicated discussions we could have about whether to grant that first part, that it's that the various worlds are incommensurable in terms of the value comparisons between them. But I mean, I would be tempted to just say that sure, we can talk about like some fundamental conditions that God needs to have on his world in order to like make sure that it is within that category of acceptable. And I think that we would fail those conditions. So, I mean, at least the kind of problem of evil that I would be interested in would be compatible uh, with that particular assumption that Kyle's making. Like, I think that the best possible type of world doesn't include a lot of the things that we see in our world. So that's all I really have to say about that.
Right, and also I would just say, like, just through brute intuition pumps, that this doesn't seem to be the best possible kind of world at all. Like, it seems to me that if you take a world otherwise identical to ours, but it doesn't have, like, things we consider to be horrible, like baby cancer or malaria, or things like there's this skin disease called the butterfly skin disease, where like children get it as babies, and like it causes like horrific blisters, and they're just experiencing agonizing suffering for like the entire time where they're alive. Seems to me that like a world otherwise the same as ours, like with embodied moral agents and whatnot, but lacking those things, seems to me that kind of world would be not incommensurable with this world, but clearly better.
Yeah, I mean, just subtract out something like torture from the world, like that specific category of like horrific moral evil. It doesn't seem like you're just comparing like two of the same types of world. It seems like you're fundamentally getting rid of one of the most horrific moral evils that's out there. Or even just think about the fact that human beings exist as opposed to all the other possible beings that could exist. This is something I'm going to talk about in an upcoming post on my blog. But
right.
I mean, human beings are so fundamentally limited in everything that we can experience, even when it comes to like the good value states, like soul making, all of these things. Like we can only really achieve these things in very limited, imperfect ways. Like we are really, I mean, I think in Paul Draper's words, in terms of intelligence, we're a hairbreadth away from monkeys. Like we are a very, very primitive kind of being. And if you think about all the kinds of beings that God could create, I mean, I can imagine many, many types of world far above ours with beings who are engaged in a far more advanced and interesting experience of soul making than we are. It's just an example of the sort of ways that the type of world that we're in could be better, at least when it comes to my intuitions. So I mean, we have an argument back and forth about that. But as far as I'm concerned, you can definitely run the problem of evil given that assumption.
Yeah, and another point that's worth making, and I made this response to like a video I responded to on invoking theism, who made this sort of like quasi-Leibnizian theodicy as well, is, well, look at the antecedent probabilities. Like, sure, you can tell a story about how this is the best possible kind of world, and because it includes embodied moral agents, but it seems to me that there's going to be a set of stories that you can tell that are going to be have an equal amount of antecedent probability. So say you want to say that this is like not a best possible kind of world, but rather a world in between, like a mixed world, because it has the greatest pleasures and the worst pains, the highest virtues and the worst vices. We can plausibly tell a story that this is a mixed world, or we can tell a story about how this is like the worst possible kind of world, given just the amount of horrific suffering in here, and I can cite that as my evidence and say, well, look, this is a worst possible kind of world. So it doesn't seem to me that the story that Kyle's relying on here about this being the best possible kind of world, it doesn't seem to me that that's uniquely motivated compared to these other stories I can tell that are consistent with a sort of explanatory hypothesis I can use. So like we were looking at the antecedent probabilities, and if you don't give any independent motivation for your view here, it seems to me that I could just tell some equally consistent story, and then there you go. Like, do you agree with my point there?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it seems like I think most people's intuitions would be that this is sort of a very mixed type of world. If you ask just most people what their intuition was, like, yeah, there's some good stuff, but there's also a lot of really bad stuff. The intuition that this is the best. There's definitely not an intuition that this is the best possible type of world. That's definitely something that has to be motivated. So,
yeah.
Not saying it can't be done, but we need an argument for it.
Yeah. Well, they just follow that any will God create, because every world that another being could have created, such that they would be more better. And so all that follow is that no being can actually such that they're more perfect. And there's a couple people in this, one by Class Gray, one by William Rowe. I know the Howard Schneider's. I can't remember which Howard Schneider was.
But the problem is that theism is not committed to the proposition that God has to create a best world. It's only committed to the proposition that God has to create a best kind of world. Okay, that's all that theism is committed to, a best kind of world, not a best world. Right? So when we change the conditions, when we say no, God is constrained to create a best kind of world, there's nothing contradictory about that. You can't generate a contradiction from that, right? So I don't really see where. Anyways.
That's what we try to argue against. That's the awful world argument. I don't think it succeeds. I think I'm not negotiating the restriction. My other approach here is that even though God would create best possible world, there's no best possible world, God would create best possible world. It's still not obvious that God would create perfect world, right? His perfect world doesn't have the best possible world, which means a world that has flaws. You can imagine a world that have higher.
So okay, so this goes back to my Ben Watkins response on this, but when it comes to the imperfection argument, which is the one that Ben brought up, because I'm going to assume, I think Ben's argument is probably better than this one that he brings up, but I'm just going to bring up Ben's argument just for the sake of argument. So I think we understand we're talking about a perfect world, right? I think the best way to understand this is like, it's perfect in a sort of relative sense, right? So one way to think about it is like, there's this ideal instance of a given world, right? And so a perfect world would be a world in which lacks nothing and has no defects relative to the status as that world, right? And of course, Ben would say that a world is perfect if its wrong-making properties are sufficiently counterbalanced by its right-making properties, both known and unknown, right? Now, again, I think this still does run into the problem of...
All right, I think he's confusing two arguments here. Like, he's confusing a sort of argument from imperfection with Michael Tooley's equiprobability argument from evil. I guess it's sort of like worth pointing out here. He seems to, it's not that the argument that Ben Watkins ran in his debate against Trent Horn, if I'm recalling correctly, was an argument. Was Michael Tooley's argument, which argues from an equiprobability principle. It wasn't an argument from imperfection, so he's sort of confusing two arguments here.
Compressibility and axiology, right? If we're going to talk about a best world, we can just refer to a best kind of world. But this gets into the whole balancing off goods versus the defeat, right? And the problem is that defeat affirms that the negative or positive value of the part of a world may be said to be defeated within the whole world. So when we're talking about the whole world, we're talking about the entire timeline of that world, right? And of course, I would argue that the defeat condition is an aesthetic condition, right? And just to define the defeat condition here, as Adams and Snyder would define defeat as an evil is defeated when it is integrated as a constituent part of a valuable possible whole that not only outweighs the evil, but cannot be as valuable without the evil. In that instance, the evil remains evil in its own right, but it is defeated, right? So one example is like, okay, pain is intrinsically bad, right? But pain can obviously be defeated. You can overcome pain, right? So yes, pain is intrinsically bad, but you can overcome pain, which is what the concept of defeat is, right? Again, that's one example. There's plenty of others I can give. I just wanted to clarify that. But when we understand that the defeat condition applies to a value whole rather than value parts, then you're not going to be able to make any sort of argument that like, oh yeah, you have this perfect world in terms of a value parts paradigm, right? And so I think the problem here is that, I mean, just to be fair, I don't know if I mentioned the value whole versus value parts paradigm here, but the point here is like, it seems like he's assuming this value parts paradigm, which I would not accept in terms of that. So yeah. Anyways, let's continue on.
Yeah, I'm not sure how I was assuming a value parts paradigm, but do you think this is the proper time for me to open up my slides on the defeat condition and for you to offer your thoughts on the defeat condition now?
Yeah, let's look at the slides.
All right. Also, I think your screen is lagging a bit, but.
No,
apologize. You're good now. Okay. So let's see. Where's the slide? We might as well just talk about the defeat condition now since he's been bringing it up a bit. So hold on. Let's see here. Yes. Do you see my screen here?
Yep, you're good.
And you see the slides?
Yep.
Good. Right. So we got the layout here. Blah 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 blah. So the defeat condition. So I'll just read my slide here. The defeat condition, as I understand Kyle to have characterized it, states that if an evil is defeasible, that is, if the evil could be defeated in natural life, so that it makes the suffering of the creature a valuable constituent of a greater composable whole, in such a way that the creature's life overall would not be valuable without the suffering, then the evil fails to be any evidence at all against the theistic hypothesis. Only indefeasible evil could disconfirm the theistic hypothesis. I contend that if Kyle wants to leverage the defeat condition to negate the evidential force of the evidential problem of evil, he faces a dilemma. Either there is some phenomena we can observe in principle that we would be justified in believing is an instance of an indefeasible evil, or there isn't. If there is, plausibly we have already observed it, or at least it has already occurred. When we reflect on things like the evil of the Holocaust, natural disasters, horrifically painful ailments and diseases, child sex trafficking, the pain of being ripped apart and molded alive, which billions of sentient creatures have felt for millions of years, as far as we can tell, at least as far as our evidence shows, such evils are not defeasible. It seems eliminating such evils would benefit the sufferers, all things considered, right? Because that's what he means by indefeasible evil. It's evil that benefits the sufferers. It's a net benefit for the sufferer. But it seems to me that there's plenty of evils that we can think of that seem to be net negative for the sufferer. But in any case, if there isn't any evil we'd be justified in believing is indefeasible, then theism, in conjunction with the defeat condition, is devoid of empirical content. For any evil we can observe, there will always be the possibility of appealing to possible states of affairs outside of our experience, such as in particular that the evil could be defeated in natural life in such a way that the evil increases the value of the creature's life overall and is thereby in all things considered good. Even if there were indefeasible evils, there is no way we could test that with our experience, and there is no way we can know it. Thus, there is nothing we can experience that would be unexpected in the theistic hypothesis, on Kyle's view at least, and this makes theism extremely unvirtuous as an explanatory hypothesis, and possibly inscrutable. So, do you have anything to add on to that, or anything to say?
No, I completely agree with that. I would have gone in a similar direction and said that, look, like if you want to take the defeat condition and just like conjoin that with theism as sort of the content of the hypothesis, it's compatible. Hypothetically, it's compatible with any kind of evils that we might observe if you want to appeal enough to mystery, right? Like you could have the most horrific world just filled with torture and just awful moral evil. And you could say, well, it's possible that this will all be defeated if you are thinking of defeat so broadly, but like there's any kind of evil that, if certain unknown things happen in the afterlife, we could defeat any kind of evil. And that's really the problem, I think, with the defeat thing, is that it doesn't really, at least when we're talking about like Draper's kind of version of the problem of evil, conjoining it into the theistic hypothesis, I don't think really helps, because it's, unless you put specific conditions on what can and cannot be defeated, it's pretty much compatible with any sort of state of affairs that we might observe, meaning that it doesn't distinguish between states of affairs, meaning that it doesn't lead us to predict any particular kind of world. Now, if you want to put conditions on like how defeat works, then we can start talking about that. But I think the second you do that, then like you said, we're going to find that defeat isn't compatible with the sort of evils that we do observe. The other thing I'd want to point out is that the defeat condition, under some pretty plausible arguments, entails kind of moral paralysis.
That's my next slide.
It is. Okay, well,
ahead of the gun.
All right, I didn't even know that's your next slide. All right, go ahead and read your next
just
slide.
Read that?
Yes.
Another folly of appealing to the defeat condition as an attempt to completely diffuse the evidential problem of evil is that, in a similar vein to skeptical theism, there seems to be a moral paralysis worry. If for every instance of evil it is a net benefit for the sufferer, then it would seem we wouldn't be doing good by the sufferer by acting to prevent their suffering. In fact, by preventing their suffering, we may be taking away the possibility of them experiencing goods in the afterlife, making their life more pro toto valuable, in which case we'd actually be wronging them. So if, for instance, we see a baby drowning, we wouldn't have an undefeated moral reason to save him. This is absurd. This completely just negates our ordinary moral practice. And here are a few objections. I actually preempted a few objections here. So objection 1, this assumes consequentialism. No, it doesn't. What it assumes is that consequences are morally relevant to what actions we should do, which is a feature every sane ethical theory shares. Like, presumably, even the most crazy deontologist would agree that, stabbing someone, if it created like an immense amount of pleasure instead of pain, that would sort of like remove the deontological constraint on stabbing people, right? Consequences are minimally morally relevant to what actions we should do, and the defeat, this sort of moral paralysis objection I'm running, has nothing to do. It doesn't assume a consequentialism at all, and it's really weird that I keep seeing this argument pop up. Oh, this assumes consequentialism. This assumes consequentialism. No, it does not. But here's perhaps a better response. So objection 2, and this misses the distinction between human reasons and divine reasons. Humans are obligated, or at least have prima facie reason, to help their fellow man when in need. God, on the other hand, is in a unique moral position where he knows what's best for us ultima facie, and this includes permitting our suffering so that we are redeemed and build saintly virtues in an afterlife. Right. So reply 2. I grant the point about God plausibly having different moral reasons than humans. But let's ask, in virtue of what does God have different moral reasons? Presumably it's something like God's unlimited knowledge gives him the ability to access facts which humans couldn't comprehend due to their limited cognitive capacities. Meaning, if a human knew the relevant facts that God knew, their moral reasons would change. In particular, if one comes to know that a given sufferer's suffering is a net benefit to them, given that it will be defeated in the afterlife, it seems this removes moral reasons one otherwise would have to prevent the suffering. In ordinary moral practice, we prevent suffering because we have a good reason to think we are doing good by the suffering. For example, we wouldn't prevent the suffering caused by a dental operation precisely because we knew the suffering would be a net benefit for the sufferer. So yeah, that's the moral paralysis objection.
Yeah, so that's a nice summary of it. The only thing that I would even add is you don't even have to make the arguments that given this defeat condition, we have no reason to intervene to stop instances of horrific suffering. All you can just say is it takes away our moral obligation to intervene in horrific suffering, because it's pretty clear, I think, to most people that we have moral obligations to intervene and prevent horrific suffering. But I think that if you think that all suffering is a net benefit to the sufferer, which is what the defeat condition entails, then it's no longer clear that we have a moral obligation to intervene to prevent suffering. If any, you could even make the stronger arguments that we should allow suffering to occur because it will be a net benefit for the sufferer. But I don't think you even have to go that far. You just have to say it takes away our moral obligation, and it pretty clearly does, as far as I can tell. If you look at any, I think this is the example that Stephen Mason uses in his paper, but imagine a child getting a vaccine. Now, if vaccines didn't do anything good for the child, if it was just someone jabbing a child with a needle, then obviously it would seem like we have a sort of moral obligation to go and stop that, especially for a vaccine that's really, really painful. If we assume that vaccines don't do anything and this is just some random person injecting a child with a needle, that's a instance of suffering that should be prevented. But given our knowledge that that overall the suffering is going to be a net benefit for the child, we definitely no longer have a moral obligation to prevent children from getting vaccinations. And if anything, given any instance of suffering, the more horrible it is, the more of a net benefit it must ultimately be for the sufferer. And so it messes with our moral intuitions even more, because the worst kinds of suffering must lead to the very best kinds of benefits later on, in order for them to be justified. So if anything, the very worst instances of suffering are the ones we have the least moral obligation to prevent, because it's those instances of suffering they're going to have the most sort of elaborate kinds of defeat that occur in the afterlife. Like it must be like the best kind of benefits for the sufferers, and it's the least bad kinds of suffering, like paper cuts or things like that are going to have the least net benefit for the sufferer, like in terms of the amount of defeat you need, or the kind of defeat that you need to compensate, or I should say to defeat the suffering. So it seems like it messes with our moral intuitions even more in that sense, where the worst kinds of suffering become the ones that we have a least moral obligation to intervene in.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Another example, I think it's either Bruce Russell or Stephen Milton use it, maybe both. Is an example of a tribesman, his son being having conducted surgery on him by a surgeon from the future. So suppose based on what the tribesman knows, all he knows is that the surgeon is cutting his son open, and he's maiming his son. Well, then he has a reason to intervene. But then when he gets the additional knowledge that the surgeon's from the future, he's acting in his interest, and if there was a reason for the surgeon to be doing what he's doing, then he wouldn't expect to know it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, whatever other things you want to add. Then it seems that the tribesman is paralyzed, and he no longer has a reason to intervene and prevent his surgeon from cutting his son open. And in a very analogous way, once you learn that the defeat condition is true, and that for every instance of suffering we see, it's going to be a net benefit for the sufferer, right? It's going to be a benefit for them, all things considered. It seems to me that just paralyzes, it removes your reasons to sort of intervene in the suffering in the same way it does for the tribesman and his son getting cut open by the surgeon. Right. Do you agree with that?
Yep.
Right. How are we on time? Do we have more time, or?
What do we want to? I have time for one small block of another piece of content if you have another slide to read or something. But if it's a whole new topic, maybe we should wait on it. Depends what you think. What is the next sort of content that goes on in the video?
I mean, we can watch it and see what's going on. I think.
Okay, let's see what happens next and make a decision based on that.
Okay.
So that assumes that God's value contains all values, which I reject. So I would say that God is a maximally valuable being. God is not what's called an omni-valuable being, which means God does not actually have himself. God does not have all the values that could possibly exist, right? Because there are certain values that actually do depend upon a sort of contingent world, right? And so if there are values that sort of depend, and again, I went over this in my video in the Probable, but basically the idea is yes, God does not have all possible values, or at least not all, I would say all possible values, because you could have some values that are contradictory. So I'm going to say for the sake of argument, just for clarity, when I'm talking about all values, I'm talking about all the possible values or values that are logically coherent with each other, because obviously there might be some values that cannot exist in the same world, but regardless. So yes, God is a maximally valuable being, but that does not mean that therefore he has all values, right? I think that you are going to get all values from a created world, right? So yeah, that's all I have to say. But
yeah, I already addressed this. This was in regards to my argument from imperfection. So basically, yeah, I mean that's pretty much. I guess I can go back on my slides here. So yeah, what I'm arguing from is a premise that says an omnipotent, omniscient person is morally perfect only if he eliminates any evil which is such that for any good that entails that there's a greater good which does not entail it. And from this argument, for any evil God permits, there's going to be another logically possible state of affairs that's better. Since God is the greatest possible good, there's going to always be a greater good that God could have permitted that does not entail the evil. So it seems to me that given this plausible premise, which I justified in the later slides, you can get sort of the conclusion, the desired conclusion just from this sort of argument here. But obviously, Kyle will probably just reject one of the premises, so I don't know. But whatever. Yeah, and I sort of explicitly address the sort of point that he's getting at. Yeah, there's going to be value. Say there's value missing from a world with God alone. Well, still, it seems to me that any evil God permits is going to be there's always going to be a greater good God could have permitted, since God is the greatest possible good. There's going to always be a greater good that doesn't entail evil. So it doesn't seem to me that there's going to be any state of affairs where God would have a good reason to permit evil. So like, regardless of whether there's going to be more value in a world with creation, I would say that it's still going to be the case that God would not permit evil. But like that's a whole other discussion. Should we just close off, or do you have anything further to add? Or
No, but then it seems like a good time to close off. If we want to do like a 4-way discussion at some point in the future, I'd be happy to do that. But let's close off for now, and we'll get back to this another time.
right?
You can keep going if you want without me, but if you want to wait, that's also fine.
I don't know. Like, when do you think would be a good time? Because I'm free tomorrow and Tuesday, I think.
Let's discuss it off stream because I have to look at my schedule and everything.
Okay, sure. I'll probably just end it now then. All right.
Okay, sounds like a plan.
Right.
Well,
See you next
thanks
time.
for watching, everyone. See you next